The lore of Killzone 3 begins in the immediate, suffocating aftermath of the invasion of Helghan. The story picks up mere seconds after the conclusion of the second game, centering on the sovereignty of the power vacuum. With the death of the autarch, Emperor Visari, at the hands of Rico Velasquez, the Helghast people are left without a voice, but not without a bite. This represents the lore of the martyr's wrath. Visari's death did not break the Helghast spirit. It galvanized it into a fanatical, directionless rage. The environment of the capital city, Pyrrhus, is a nightmare of nuclear winter, a radioactive wasteland created by Visari's own red dust detonation. The primary objective for the ISA Interplanetary Strategic Alliance is no longer victory, but the sovereignty of the desperate retreat. The invasion has failed. The ISA fleet is shattered, and the ground forces are scattered across a dying city. This introduces the lore of the abandoned soldier. Characters Savchenko and Rico must navigate the ruins of Pyrrhus, which is now a sovereignty of the toxic rubble. The environment is a jagged landscape of twisted rebar, gray ash, and the emerald-green glow of irradiated petricite. This represents the lore of the post-apocalyptic urban warfare, where every corner holds a Helghast sniper who views the ISA not as occupiers, but as the murderers of their father. Inside the Helghast High Command, a different war is brewing, the sovereignty of the political vulture. With Visari gone, two titans vie for the throne. First is Admiral Orlok, the commander of the Helghast military. He represents the lore of the Iron Fist, believing in raw, overwhelming martial power. Opposing him is Jordan Stahl, the CEO of Stahl Arms. Stahl represents the sovereignty of the industrial overlord. He is the man who built the Helghast war machine, and he views the military as an inefficient tool. This conflict introduces the lore of the Civil Cold War, where the Helghast are as much a threat to each other as they are to the ISA. The environment of the Stahl Arms research facility provides a stark contrast to the ruins of the city. This is the sovereignty of the clinical terror. It is a world of polished white floors, blue energy conduits, and the irradiated petricite weapons that Stahl is perfecting. This represents the lore of the technological escalation. Stahl is developing a weapon capable of cascading organic matter, literally vaporizing human beings from the inside out. This turns the environment into a sovereignty of the invisible death. Sev, must witness the horrifying efficiency of these weapons as they are tested on ISA prisoners of war. The lore of the Helghast sniper is refined in this chapter. In the gray ruins of Pyrrhus, the iconic glowing red eyes are the only warning a Marine gets. This represents the sovereignty of the Predator's mark. The Helghast are masters of their environment. They don't need heat seekers because they know every vent and sewer line in the city. The environment is a sovereignty of the vertical ambush, where ISA squads are picked apart by marksmen using the VC-32 sniper rifle. Sev has to rely on his sovereignty of the tactical awareness, using smoke and suppressive fire just to move across a single city block. As the ISA attempts to reach the extraction point, they realize the lore of the final departure. The ISA cruisers remaining in orbit are being picked off by Stahl's new orbital defense spires. This represents the sovereignty of the blockade. The ISA is trapped on a planet that is literally poisoning them. The environment of the evacuation zone is a chaotic mess of burning dropships and screaming wounded. This represents the lore of the failed promise, where the High Command on Vecta has essentially written off the remaining soldiers as acceptable losses. Sev and Rico are left to wonder if they are fighting for a cause or just for the next 5 minutes of breath. The air on Helghan is a character in itself. It is heavy air, filled with the particulate of industrial waste and the ozone of petricite weapons. This is the sovereignty of the respiratory struggle. Every soldier wears a mask not just for identity but for survival. This represents the lore of the masked society. The Helghast look like monsters because they have adapted to a monstrous world. The environment of the ash tracks outside the city shows the true scale of the planet, a world that was never meant to sustain life, yet produced the most resilient warriors in the galaxy. As the part ends, Savchenko looks back at the mushroom cloud still hanging over Pyrrhus. The lore of the lost cause is heavy on his mind. The golden age of the ISA invasion is a contract written in nuclear ash, and Sev is the only witness left to sign the exit. He boards a ragged transport, but a Stahl Arms stalker walker appears through the fog, its red eyes burning with a promise of total annihilation. The retreat has just become a fight for the soul of the ISA. The sound of the Helghast war horns echoes through the canyons of steel. The lore of the Helghan counterstrike has begun. Sev readies his rifle, the green glow of the irradiated city reflecting in his eyes. The ISA survivors are forced away from the industrial ruins and into the Helghan jungle, a biome that defies every law of Terran biology. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the alien ecosystem. This isn't a natural forest. It is a petricite-infused nightmare where the flora is as lethal as the fauna. This represents the lore of the living trap. The environment is dominated by burrowing vines and spore-generating fungi that glow with a sickening green light. This is the sovereignty of the poisonous green, where the very air can cause respiratory failure if a soldier's mask seal is compromised. Sev and Rico must navigate this vertical labyrinth while being stalked by enemies who have integrated themselves into the predatory cycle of the woods. The primary tactical threat in the jungle is the Helghast capture trooper. This introduces the lore of the CQC specialist. These units are the elite of the Helghast infantry, equipped with invisibility cloaks and dual-mounted wrist blades. This represents the sovereignty of the silent executioner. Unlike the standard grunts, capture troopers do not use firearms. They rely on speed and the lore of the terror takedown. The environment provides them with perfect concealment among the shifting, glowing vines. Sev has to rely on his sovereignty of the primal reflex, listening for the slight shimmer of displaced air or the snap of a twig. This turns the mission into a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek where the loser is gutted in the dark. To combat the density of the jungle and the armored threats lurking within, Sev discovers the Wasp rocket launcher. This introduces the lore of the swarm ordnance. The Wasp is the sovereignty of the portable artillery, capable of firing a curtain of micromissiles that saturate an entire area. This represents the lore of the scorched earth policy. In the cramped, foliage-heavy environment, precision is impossible, so the ISA relies on overwhelming fire volume. The lore of the Emerald Fire describes the result: the green jungle turning into a black, charred crater in seconds. Sev uses the Wasp to clear spider mine nests and to bring down the massive Helghast heavy tanks that attempt to push through the undergrowth. The environment of the jungle floor is a graveyard of petricite spires. These jagged crystals pulse with raw energy, serving as the batteries for the planet. This is the sovereignty of the geological battery. The lore suggests that the jungle's hyperaggression is fueled by this radiation. This represents the lore of the irradiated evolution. Sev can use these spires as environmental weapons. A well-placed bullet can cause a spire to detonate, releasing a petricite shockwave that disintegrates anything nearby. This is the tactical sovereignty of the resourceful soldier, turning the planet's own lifeblood against the Helghast occupiers. Inside the jungle's heart lies the Helghast Research Outpost Gamma. This is the sovereignty of the botanical laboratory. Here, Stahl scientists are harvesting the jungle's toxins to create new chemical weapons. This represents the lore of the weaponized nature. Sev finds stasis pods containing captured ISA soldiers being exposed to alien spores to test their lethality. This adds a layer of moral sovereignty to the mission. The ISA isn't just trying to escape, they are trying to stop a biological atrocity. The environment is a jarring mix of high-tech glass observation decks and raw, oozing organic matter. Sev's objective shifts to ecological sabotage, overloading the outpost's cooling systems to let the jungle reclaim the facility. As the ISA reaches the edge of the jungle, they encounter the lore of the Helghast Beastmasters. These specialized units use sonic prods to drive packs of native Helghan mawbirds toward the ISA lines. This represents the sovereignty of the biological proxy. The environment is filled with the screeching of avian predators and the barking of Helghast handlers. This is the lore of the primal war, where the line between soldier and animal is blurred. Sev must use the M224A1 light machine gun to hold back the tide of feathers and teeth. The golden age of the ISA's mission is now a struggle in the Emerald Gut, and Sev is the only knife left to cut a path out. The air begins to thin as the jungle gives way to the frozen shores. Sev looks back at the glowing green canopy, his suit covered in alien spores and Helghast blood. The lore of the green grave is behind them, but the ice ahead is even more unforgiving. The Golden Age is a world of teeth and thorns, and the sovereignty of the survivor is all that matters. Sev checks his Wasp launcher, the last of the missiles locked and loaded. The ISA survivors emerge from the emerald suffocations of the jungle only to be met by the frozen shores, a brutal coastline where the planet's erratic climate creates massive glaciers of ice and salt. The lore here transitions to the sovereignty of the Sub-Zero Desert. This environment is a jagged wasteland of whiteout blizzards and towering ice shelves that groan under their own weight. This represents the lore of the Absolute Zero, where the primary enemy is the cold itself. The ISA's standard issue armor is not rated for these temperatures, forcing Sev and Rico to move between heat vents and abandoned Helghast thermal shelters to avoid freezing. This is the sovereignty of the shivering soldier, where survival is measured in the minutes remaining in a thermal battery. The primary technological threat on the ice is the Helghast ice saw. This introduces the lore of the Industrial Ravager. These are massive, treaded vehicles equipped with forward-mounted circular saws designed to cut through glaciers and ISA squads. This represents the sovereignty of the mechanical terror. The environment of the salt flats allows these vehicles to reach terrifying speeds, turning the battlefield into a high-velocity slaughter. The lore of the Blizzard Charge describes how the Helghast use the limited visibility to strike and disappear. Sev must use the VC-11 bolt gun, a weapon that fires explosive projectiles, to puncture the saw's fuel lines. This is the sovereignty of the kinetic impact, where a single well-placed bolt can turn an industrial giant into a frozen fireball. Dominating the horizon is the Helghast Mobile Factory, a gargantuan walking fortress the size of a city block. This is the sovereignty of the Steel Colossus. The factory moves on 6 massive hydraulic legs, processing the planet's ice into liquid petrocite fuel as it travels. This represents the lore of the moving hegemony. The environment inside the factory is a jarring contrast to the ice outside. It is a world of molten metal, roaring furnaces, and the deafening clank of heavy machinery. This is the sovereignty of the industrial heart. Sev's mission is to board this beast and sabotage its primary intake valves. The lore of the Stairway to Hell describes the vertical climb up the factory's legs while under fire from Wasp turrets. The Helghast jetpack troopers make their debut in this sector. This introduces the lore of the vertical superiority. These elite units use petrocite-powered flight to bypass the treacherous ice entirely, raining down fire from above. This represents the sovereignty of the aerial predator. The environment of the factory catwalks becomes a 360-degree combat zone. Sev is forced to hijack a Helghast jetpack to pursue them, leading to the lore of the dogfight in the smog. This represents the sovereignty of the sky-high risk. Fighting while airborne requires a level of coordination the ISA Marines weren't trained for, turning the battle into a desperate struggle for balance and altitude over the churning gears of the factory. Inside the factory's refining core, Sev discovers the lore of the Stahl Orlok rift. He intercepts a transmission between Admiral Orlok and Jordan Stahl. Orlok wants the factory to produce fuel for the Home Guard, while Stahl is diverting resources to his private Stahl Arms fleet. This is the sovereignty of the fractured command. The lore of the corporate coup reveals that Stahl is planning to supersede the military entirely. The environment around the core is a sovereignty of the unstable energy, where blue petrocite gas leaks from the pipes. Sev realizes that the Helghast are so busy fighting for the crown that they have left their neck exposed. This solidifies his sovereignty of the saboteur as he targets the factory's pressure regulators. The environment of the factory's cargo bay is a forest of steel, filled with thousands of MAW-12 rocket launchers being prepared for shipment to the front lines. This is the lore of the endless arsenal. Sev uses these weapons to hold back the security droids, small, hovering machines equipped with stun prods. This represents the sovereignty of the automated sentry. The lore of the factory floor stand describes the chaos of a million-ton machine tearing itself apart from the inside. This is the sovereignty of the mechanical suicide. As the factory begins to tilt, the environment becomes a slope of death, with heavy shipping crates sliding across the floor like high-speed projectiles. The climax of the Frozen Shores occurs as the mobile factory collapses into the sea. This is the sovereignty of the oceanic grave. The lore of the icebreak describes the massive tidal wave created by the factory's fall, which shatters the surrounding glaciers for miles. This represents the sovereignty of the environmental shockwave. Sev and Rico must leap from the falling deck onto a departing ISA intruder dropship. This is the lore of the leap of faith. Looking down, they see the gargantuan machine sinking into the black, freezing water, its green petrocite lights flickering out one by one. The Golden Age is a world of sinking iron, and Sev is the only anchor left to cut the rope. The air in the dropship is freezing, the breath of the Marines visible in the dim red light. Sev looks at the data drive he stole from the factory's bridge. The lore of the Stahl's plan is finally in his hands. He realizes that the war on Helghan was just a distraction for something much larger. The Golden Age is a contract signed in liquid ice, and the sovereignty of the truth is the only thing that can save the ISA fleet. Sev checks his rifle, the cold metal sticking to his gloves. The shores are behind them, but the Stahl Arms Research Complex lies ahead in the jungle of steel. As the part ends, the dropship banks toward the north, away from the ice and toward the glowing towers of the Helghast industrial heartland. The lore of the final stronghold is the final destination. The sound of the wind howling outside the hull is the sovereignty of the void, a reminder that on Helghan, nowhere is safe. The ISA survivors penetrate the inner perimeter of the Stahl Arms space elevator, a vertical megalith that serves as the umbilical cord between Helghan's surface and its orbital shipyards. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the atmospheric piercing. This is the peak of Helghast engineering, a structure so tall that its upper reaches are anchored in the vacuum of space. The environment is a dizzying mix of high-speed maglev tracks and external maintenance scaffolds that vibrate with the hum of high-output petrocite. This represents the lore of the industrial ascent. As Sev and Rico climb, the ground below disappears into the permanent gray smog of the planet, replaced by the sovereignty of the thin air, where the wind howls with enough force to pull a soldier off the railings. The primary tactical threat within the elevator complex is the Helghast infiltrator. This introduces the lore of the Mimic Soldier. These are Stahl's elite security units, equipped with advanced active camouflage that bends light around their armor. This represents the sovereignty of the unseen blade. Unlike the capture troopers of the jungle, infiltrators are trained for urban ghosting, hiding in plain sight against the brushed steel and glass of the facility. The lore of the Static Hunter describes the psychological toll this takes on the ISA. Sev must watch for the slight shimmer of refractive distortion against the facility's neon lights. One wrong step leads to a stun-batten execution, a silent end in a world of humming machines. Turok, wait, Sev discovers the lore of the Stahl Arms prototype. In the testing bays of the lower elevator, he finds the VC-5 electricity gun. This introduces the sovereignty of the arcing death. The weapon fires a continuous stream of high-voltage lightning that jumps between targets, bypassing Helghast armor and frying their internal electronics. This represents the lore of the energy monopoly. In the tight, metal-heavy corridors of the space elevator, the VC-5 is the sovereignty of the bottleneck, capable of clearing entire hallways with a single trigger pull. However, the weapon is volatile. The environment is filled with power couplers that can explode if struck by the arc, turning the room into a lethal cage of electricity. The environment of the Ascension pods provides a unique sovereignty of the moving battlefield. These pods are the size of houses, moving at hundreds of miles per hour up the elevator's tether. This is the lore of the high-velocity siege. The ISA must fight their way from pod to pod using grav hooks, while being harassed by Helghast overlord gunships. This represents the sovereignty of the vertical dogfight. The lore of the Tether War describes the terror of fighting on the exterior of a moving vessel where gravity is the most consistent killer. Sev uses the M82G assault rifle to pick off scout snipers on adjacent pods, the green tracer fire streaking through the thinning atmosphere like falling stars. Inside the command hub, located halfway up the tether, Sev discovers the lore of the green fire. He finds the blueprints for Stahl's secret project, the orbital petrocyte cannon. This represents the sovereignty of the extinction event. The weapon doesn't fire traditional explosives. It fires a beam of irradiated petrocyte that triggers a molecular decay in its targets. This is the lore of the atomic erasure. The environment around the hub is filled with sample canisters of this weaponized gas, which glows with a haunting, neon green brilliance. Sev realizes that Stahl isn't just trying to win the war. He's trying to replace the Helghast military with a weapon that makes soldiers obsolete. This solidifies the sovereignty of the saboteur's burden. The environment of the external scaffolding is a cathedral of ribbed steel. This is the sovereignty of the high-altitude hazard. Here, the oxygen levels are so low that the ISA must rely on emergency rebreathers. This represents the lore of the suffocating height. The lore of the oxygen rush describes the frantic combat where every bullet hole in a soldier's suit is a death sentence. Sev encounters the Helghast Sentinels, autonomous drones that use sonic scanning to find targets through the thick clouds. This is the sovereignty of the automated hunt. The environment is a chaotic soundscape of metal groaning under atmospheric pressure and the constant chirp-chirp of drone sensors. The climax of the space elevator infiltration occurs at the airlock terminal. As Sev prepares to board the final pod to the orbital station, he is intercepted by Stahl's personal bodyguards. These units wear petrocyte-infused power armor, representing the sovereignty of the Juggernaut. They are immune to small arms fire and can move with surprising speed due to servo assist. This is the lore of the unstoppable wall. Sev must use the sovereignty of the environmental hazard, shooting the hydraulic seals of the airlock to depressurize the room. The resulting explosive decompression sucks the armored guards into the void, while Sev anchors himself using his combat knife. The air in the final pod is thin and tastes of copper. Sev looks down at the planet Helghan, which is now just a swirling marble of gray and green far below. The lore of the view from the heavens is a moment of cold clarity. The Golden Age is a world of dust under a glass ceiling, and Sev is the only shatter left to break the surface. He watches the stars become visible as the pod nears the orbital station. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the vacuum, and the sovereignty of the final breath is all he has left. He checks his remaining grenades, his hands shaking from the lack of pressure. As the part ends, the pod docks with the Stahl Arms orbital array. The mechanical docking clamps sound like the closing jaws of a trap. The lore of the Stahl Sanctum is the final destination. The sound of the vacuum hissing through the seals is the sovereignty of the end, a reminder that in space, nobody can hear the ISA scream. The ISA survivors exit the docking pod and step into the Stahl Arms orbital array, a sterile, sprawling station that hangs like a jagged crown over the planet Helghan. The lore here shifts from the gritty, industrial decay of the surface to the sovereignty of the high-tech utopia. This environment is characterized by blindingly white corridors, holographic interfaces, and the rhythmic pulse of blue petrocyte conduits. This represents the lore of the corporate god complex. Unlike the Helghast military bases, which feel like prisons, the orbital array feels like a temple to the future, a future where Jordan Stahl is the sole architect. The environment is eerily quiet, the only sound being the low hum of the station's life support systems, creating a sense of clinical dread. The primary defensive threat on the station is the Stahlguard synthetic. This introduces the lore of the post-human infantry. These are not men in masks, but advanced combat drones designed to mimic the movements and tactics of the elite Helghast shock troopers. This represents the sovereignty of the perfected soldier. Because they are synthetic, they do not experience suppression or fear. They move with a mechanical, unsettling precision. The lore of the inorganic hunter explains that Stahl has replaced his human workforce with these machines to ensure absolute loyalty. Sev must navigate sensor grid corridors, where the synthetics drop from the ceiling in a coordinated ambush. This is the sovereignty of the calculated kill, where survival depends on breaking the machine's logic with erratic, aggressive movement. Sev discovers the lore of the irradiated petricite beam. Deep within the station's core, he finds the firing chamber for Stahl's orbital weapon. This is the sovereignty of the molecular eraser. The weapon works by focusing raw petricite energy through a series of prism arrays, creating a beam that can disintegrate a cruiser in seconds. This represents the lore of the zero-mass war. The environment around the chamber is a sovereignty of the ionized atmosphere, where static electricity causes Sev's hair to stand on end and sparks to dance across his weapon. He realizes that the red dust of the previous war was a toy compared to this. The lore of the green sky describes the weapon's ultimate purpose: to fire upon Earth itself, triggering a global petricite reaction that would wipe out the ISA at its source. The environment of the observation deck provides a panoramic view of the sovereignty of the galactic hegemony. From here, Sev can see the remains of the ISA fleet, drifting like scrap metal in the shadow of Helghan. This is the lore of the total defeat. It is in this room that Sev has his first direct encounter with Jordan Stahl. Stahl does not appear in person, but as a towering, 3D holographic projection that follows Sev through the room. This represents the sovereignty of the omnipresent dictator. Stahl's voice is calm, devoid of the fanatical screaming of Visari. He talks about efficiency and cost-benefit analysis while showing Sev footage of the ISA's home world, Vecta, in the crosshairs. This is the lore of the corporate ultimatum, where the survival of a species is reduced to a line on a balance sheet. Inside the data sanctum, Sev and Rico find the lore of the Orlok execution. They witness a live feed of the Helghast High Command on the surface, where Stahl's automated turrets have opened fire on Admiral Orlok's personal guard. This is the sovereignty of the final purge. Stahl has officially declared the military redundant, seizing total control of the Helghast Empire. This represents the lore of the New Order. The environment of the sanctum is a digital grave, filled with the records of every Helghast citizen, now marked as assets of Stahl arms. Sev realizes that the civil war is over, Stahl has won. This solidifies his sovereignty of the last stand. If the ISA doesn't destroy this station now, there will be no one left in the galaxy to tell the story of the Helghast. The environment of the petricite storage tanks is a forest of liquid fire. This is the sovereignty of the volatile reservoir. To cripple the station, Sev must sabotage the containment fields holding the refined liquid petricite. This represents the lore of the chemical suicide. The lore of the leaking sun describes the green fluid as it begins to spill onto the deck, melting through the white floor panels like acid. Sev must navigate a series of grav plates that have begun to malfunction, flipping the room's orientation at random. This is the tactical sovereignty of the Vertigo warrior, fighting synthetics while the floor becomes the ceiling and the green acid rains upward. The climax of the orbital infiltration occurs at the primary cooling vent. As Sev prepares to plant the final detonation charges, he is intercepted by the Stahlguard commander, a massive synthetic unit equipped with dual miniguns and an energy shield. This is the sovereignty of the unstoppable engine. The battle takes place on a narrow bridge suspended over the station's main reactor. This is the lore of the heart of the machine. Sev must use the sovereignty of the precision strike, shooting the coolant pipes to create bursts of freezing gas that temporarily stun the machine's sensors. The lore of the shattered circuit is realized when Sev drives his combat knife into the commander's neural core, causing a feedback loop that ripples through every synthetic on the station. The air in the station is now screaming with alarms, the white walls turning a frantic, flashing red. Sev looks through the reinforced glass at the petricite beam, beginning to charge for its final shot. The lore of the countdown to silence is the only thing he hears. The Golden Age is a citadel of glass about to shatter, and Sev is the only hammer left to strike the blow. He watches as the first green sparks of the beam begin to form in the center of the array. The Golden Age is a contract written in light, and the sovereignty of the sacrifice is the final clause. He grabs Rico, and they sprint toward the emergency hangar as the station begins to groan under the pressure of the sabotaged reactor. As the part ends, the station's gravity fails entirely, leaving Sev and Rico drifting in a corridor of fire and debris. The lore of the weightless end is a moment of pure, terrifying silence. The station is dying, but Stahl's flagship, the Stahl 1, is detaching from the main hull. The lore of the final pursuit is the only path left. Sev kicks off a wall, drifting toward the open hangar doors and the stars beyond. The sabotage of the station's containment fields triggers a total collapse of the artificial gravity sovereignty. Sev and Rico are cast into a state of zero-G chaos, where the sterile white corridors of the orbital array become a spinning centrifuge of fire and shrapnel. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the weightless combat. In the vacuum-thin air of the dying station, every gunshot has an equal and opposite reaction, pushing the shooter backward into the debris. This represents the lore of the Newton's War. The environment is a 360-degree battlefield where there is no up or down, only the direction of the nearest explosion. Sev must navigate through the main turbine hub, where the massive fan blades are spinning out of control, creating a mechanical sovereignty of the meat grinder. The primary environmental threat is the decompression hazard. As the station's hull fractures, the lore of the vocal silence takes hold. Sections of the station are vented into space, pulling furniture, synthetics, and ISA soldiers into the black. This is the sovereignty of the atmospheric theft. Sev must use his magnetic boots to anchor himself to the deck plates, fighting against the literal pull of the universe. This represents the lore of the iron grip. The environment is a terrifying mix of blinding light from the sun and the absolute darkness of the station's interior shadows. Sev uses the M327 grenade launcher to propel himself across large gaps, the recoil acting as a makeshift thruster in the sovereignty of the improvised flight. Dominating the void outside the station is Stahl's flagship, the Stahl 1. This vessel represents the sovereignty of the corporate dreadnought. It is a sleek, obsidian-colored monster powered by a singularity core of refined petrosite. As the main station disintegrates, the flagship detaches, preparing to warp toward Earth to deliver the final blow. This introduces the lore of the spacewalk siege. Sev and Rico are forced to perform an external breach, leaping from the station's debris to the hull of the flagship. This is the sovereignty of the orbital leap. The environment is the hard vacuum, where the only sound is the vibration of Sev's own heartbeat and the muffled thump of his boots hitting the flagship's hull. The hull of the Stahl 1 is protected by automated pulse turrets. This introduces the lore of the hull defense. These turrets use motion-tracking radar to eliminate any surface threats. This represents the sovereignty of the electronic perimeter. Sev must move from hardpoint to hardpoint, using the ship's own sensor dishes as cover. The lore of the surface skirmish describes the disorientation of fighting on a curved surface while the planet Helghan looms large and green above them. This is the sovereignty of the vertigo, where the scale of the planet creates a crushing sense of insignificance. Sev uses C4 explosives to disable the turret batteries, carving a path of ruin toward the primary hangar bay. Inside the hangar bay of the Stahl 1, the environment shifts back to the sovereignty of the pressurized war. However, the air here is thick with the green petrosite mist leaking from the ship's experimental engines. This represents the lore of the irradiated interior. This mist is highly flammable, making the use of traditional firearms a risk to the ship's structural integrity. Sev is forced to rely on the sovereignty of the combat knife and the Stas-3 sniper rifle, which uses compressed gas rather than gunpowder to fire its rounds. The lore of the silent hangar describes a ghostly battle where the only light comes from the glowing green canisters and the sparks of short-circuiting synthetics. Sev discovers the lore of the Stahl 1 engine core. He finds that the ship is not just carrying the petrosite weapon. The ship is the weapon. The singularity core is designed to collapse upon arrival at Earth, creating a petrosite chain reaction in the planet's atmosphere. This is the sovereignty of the final solution. The environment around the core is a sovereignty of the gravitational distortion, where objects float and sink in irregular patterns. This represents the lore of the broken physics. Sev realizes that there is no off switch for this machine. The only way to stop the Stahl 1 is to cause a catastrophic overload before it leaves Helghan's orbit. This solidifies his sovereignty of the suicide mission. The climax of the spacewalk occurs as Stahl's personal interceptors launch from the hangar to intercept the remaining ISA intruder dropships. This is the sovereignty of the orbital dogfight. Sev must hijack a Helghast spacefighter, a Leech-class vessel, to defend the extraction team. This introduces the lore of the vacuum ace. The environment is a chaotic tapestry of green and blue tracer fire, exploding debris, and the shimmering warp trails of the flagship. This represents the sovereignty of the kinetic ballet. Sev must weave through the wreckage of the orbital array while maintaining a lock on the flagship's thermal exhaust ports. The lore of the final volley is the only thing that stands between Earth and annihilation. The air in the cockpit is cold, and the G-force of the maneuvers pins Sev against his seat. He looks at the Stahl 1 as its engines begin to glow with a blinding white light, the sign of a warp jump in progress. The lore of the moment of truth is the silence before the storm. The Golden Age is a war fought in the stars, and Sev is the only pilot left to close the gate. He watches as Rico's dropship provides a distraction burn, drawing the flagship's fire. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the vacuum, and the sovereignty of the last missile is the final payment. He pulls the trigger, sending his remaining payload directly into the heart of the flagship's engine. As the part ends, a massive, blinding flash of green light consumes the Stahl 1. The lore of the Petrosite Nova is a moment of total visual whiteout. The flagship doesn't just explode. It folds in on itself, creating a shockwave that ripples across the entire orbital plane. Sev's fighter is caught in the wake, tumbling out of control toward the planet below. The lore of the falling star is the final image, a lone warrior descending into the gray clouds of the world he tried to destroy. The Petrosite Nova in orbit causes a catastrophic chain reaction that rains fire down upon the planet, forcing Sev's damaged Leech fighter into a violent re-entry. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the atmospheric fall. Sev's craft is no longer a vehicle, but a falling coffin of screaming metal and heat shielding. This represents the lore of the kinetic re-entry. The environment shifts from the silent vacuum to a roaring furnace of orange plasma as the ship tears through the gray clouds. This is the sovereignty of the terminal velocity. Sev manages to eject seconds before the craft slams into the Helghan wastes, a region once known as the Industrial Heartland, now reduced to a sovereignty of the graveyard of ships. The environment of the graveyard is a surreal landscape of iron dunes and obsidian glass. The debris of the ISA fleet and the Stahl 1 has fallen here, creating a labyrinth of smoking hull sections and twisted wiring. This represents the lore of the fallen titans. The air is thick with the scent of ozone and the toxic green ash of vaporized petrosite. This is the sovereignty of the radioactive fog, where visibility is limited to a few meters. Sev must navigate through the ribs of the cruisers, using his sovereignty of the tracking to find signs of Rico or other survivors. The lore of the scavenger's hunt describes the desperation of finding a working radio or a clean oxygen tank among the wreckage of a failed invasion. The primary biological threat in the wastes is the irradiated Helghast remnant. These are soldiers who survived the initial orbital blasts but have been mutated by the concentrated petrosite fallout. This introduces the lore of the ghoul soldier. These units no longer follow the sovereignty of the chain of command. They are driven by a primal, radiation-induced madness. This represents the sovereignty of the dying rage. They use broken petrosite cells as improvised grenades, creating small, green explosions that leave lingering burn zones. Sev must use the VC-32 sniper rifle to eliminate them from a distance, the silent sovereignty of the long-range kill being essential in a world where every loud noise draws a swarm of the desperate. Inside the Hull cities, shelters built by survivors within the wreckage of ISA cruisers, Sev finds the lore of the deserted command. He discovers a group of ISA Marines led by Captain Narville, who have established a fortress of scrap. This represents the sovereignty of the defeated spirit. These men have given up on the mission. They are simply waiting for the radiation to kill them. This adds a layer of psychological sovereignty to Sev's journey. He must convince the survivors that the fight isn't over, that Stahl might still be alive. The environment of the fortress is a claustrophobic, dimly lit space smelling of rust and unwashed bodies, representing the lore of the military decay. The Stahl Arms recovery teams arrive in the wastes, representing the sovereignty of the corporate persistence. Even with his flagship destroyed, Stahl's automated drones and recovery walkers are scouring the wreckage for the Singularity Core. This introduces the lore of the scavenger drone. These machines use thermal scanners to find living heat signatures in the cold ash. This represents the sovereignty of the mechanical eye. The environment of the glass plains provides no cover, forcing Sev and the survivors to move during the petricite storms, when the lightning interferes with the drone sensors. This is the tactical sovereignty of the Stormrunner, using the planet's rage as a protective cloak. Sev discovers the lore of the Stahl's survival. Among the wreckage of the Stahl One's bridge, he finds an escape pod that has been opened from the inside. This is the sovereignty of the immortal villain. The lore of the Ghost of the Wastes describes Stahl as a figure emerging from the smoke. His body burned, but his mind still focused on market dominance. Stahl has taken refuge in a mobile command center buried beneath the sand. This represents the sovereignty of the subterranean bunker. The environment shifts from the open wreckage to the underground tunnels, where the walls are made of reinforced lead to block out the radiation. Sev must perform a bunker breach, using the Stas-6 missile launcher to clear the heavy blast doors. The climax of the graveyard trek occurs at the core pit, the impact site of the flagship's engine. As Sev and Rico, who reunited in the tunnels, reach the site, they are intercepted by Stahl's Praetorian Guard, the last of his elite synthetics. This is the sovereignty of the final guard. The battle takes place in a crater's cape of glowing glass, where the heat has turned the sand into a translucent floor. This is the lore of the shattered stage. Sev must use the sovereignty of the explosive precision, shooting the coolant vats on the guards' backs to trigger a cryogenic flash freeze. The lore of the ice and fire is the final tactical lesson of the Helghan War. The air in the core pit is shimmering with heat blur and the scent of ionized metal. Sev looks down into the pit and sees Jordan Stahl, standing atop the remains of the Singularity Core, holding a manual trigger. The lore of the Stahl's last stand is a moment of cold corporate defiance. Stahl isn't fighting for Helghan. He's fighting for the proprietary data inside the core. This represents the sovereignty of the data thief. The Golden Age is a world of ash and patents, and Sev is the only son of Vecta left to cancel the account. He notches his rifle, the green glow of the core reflecting in his scope. As the part ends, the ground begins to shake as the Singularity Core enters a subcritical state. The lore of the final countdown begins. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the dust, and the sovereignty of the final verdict is the only thing left. Sev pulls the trigger, the sound of the gunshot lost in the roar of the erupting earth. The confrontation at the core pit descends into a sovereignty of the molecular chaos. As the Singularity Core enters its subcritical state, the laws of gravity and physics within the crater begin to disintegrate. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the unstable atom. The environment is a terrifying display of gravitational shear, where jagged slabs of obsidian glass float upward only to be crushed into dust by localized pressure pockets. This represents the lore of the dying sun. Jordan Stahl stands at the epicenter, his scorched face illuminated by the pulsing green light of the core. He represents the sovereignty of the delusional architect, clinging to his manual trigger as if it were a scepter, believing that even in death, he can dictate the terms of the ISA's destruction. The primary tactical threat in this final duel is the Singularity Pulse. Every few seconds, the core releases a green shockwave that strips away kinetic energy. This introduces the lore of the frozen moment. During these pulses, projectiles slow down to a crawl, and Sev's own movements become sluggish, as if he were wading through thick oil. This represents the sovereignty of the time dilation. Sev must time his attacks between these pulses, using the sovereignty of the tactical rhythm to close the distance. The environment is a lethal obstacle course of floating debris. Sev must leap from one hovering hull plate to another, using his combat knife to anchor himself whenever the gravity shifts. The lore of the Stahl's final transformation is a chilling look at corporate desperation. Realizing the ISA will not let him escape, Stahl triggers a petricite injection into his own suit, a move that grants him temporary sovereignty of the augmented body. His movements become a blur of green light, and he begins to fire singularity shards, concentrated crystals of petricite that warp the space around them. This represents the lore of the human bioweapon. The environment of the core pit becomes a fractured mirror, where the air itself seems to crack under the strain of Stahl's power. Sev must use the VC-21 bolt gun, the only weapon heavy enough to maintain its trajectory through the warped atmosphere. Inside the singularity horizon, the area closest to the core, the lore of the auditory void takes hold. The roar of the wind and the screams of the dying planet are replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrates in Sev's teeth. This is the sovereignty of the final silence. The theory of the petricite consciousness is hinted at here. As the core breaks down, it seems to react to Sev's aggression. The environment shifts into a nightmare of light, where the green radiation creates ghost images of the fallen ISA Marines. This is the sovereignty of the psychological assault. Sev has to fight through the guilt of the invasion, seeing the faces of Visari and his own squad in the shimmering air. The lore of the Rico-Sev synergy reaches its climax as Rico provides suppressive explosions from the crater's rim. This represents the sovereignty of the tactical brotherhood. While Rico distracts the core's automated defense turrets, Sev performs a linear breach toward Stahl. The lore of the two-man army describes how their years of shared trauma allow them to move as a single unit without speaking. This is the sovereignty of the shared instinct. The environment is a chaotic tapestry of blue and green explosions, with Rico's Wasp rockets creating a firewall that prevents Stahl's reinforcements from entering the pit. Sev realizes that this is the moment the ISA was built for, a final, desperate act of defiance against a superior machine. The climax of the ground duel occurs at the trigger point. As Sev reaches the center, Stahl prepares to detonate the core, an act that would vaporize half of the planet's surface. This is the sovereignty of the scorched legacy. Sev doesn't use a gun. He uses the sovereignty of the cold steel. He drives his combat knife into Stahl's chest plate, severing the petricite feed that sustains him. The lore of the corporate shutdown is a moment of total physical finality. As Stahl collapses, the manual trigger falls into the black tar of the pit. This is the lore of the lost control. Stahl's final words are not of regret, but of loss of profits, a final testament to the sovereignty of the bottom line. The lore of the chain reaction begins as the singularity core begins to collapse into a gravity well. The environment of the core pit is sucked into a central point, creating a void tornado of steel and glass. This is the sovereignty of the implosion. Sev and Rico must race toward the last ISA evacuation shuttle, which is hovering at the very edge of the gravitational pull. This represents the sovereignty of the last chance. The lore of the escape from the abyss describes the sheer physical strain of running against a force that is trying to pull the marrow from your bones. Sev grabs the shuttle's boarding ramp just as the core pit disappears into a localized black hole. The air in the shuttle is thick with the scent of burning rubber and ozone. Sev looks down at the graveyard of ships as the ground beneath it vanishes into a glowing green scar. The lore of the wound in the world is the final environmental image. The Golden Age is a world of fire and collapsing stars, and Sev is the only Marine left to close the hatch. He watches as the singularity pulse levels the surrounding mountains, erasing any trace of Stahl arms. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the void, and the sovereignty of the final breath is all he has left. As the part ends, the shuttle banks toward the stars, its engines straining against the planet's gravity. The lore of the departure from Hell is a moment of pure, exhausted silence. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the dust, and the sovereignty of the survivor is the only law left. Sev closes his eyes, the green light of the implosion still burned into his retinas. The ISA evacuation shuttle pierces the thick, gray canopy of Helghan's atmosphere for the final time, leaving behind a world that has been systematically dismantled. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the solemn return. As the shuttle docks with the remains of the ISA fleet, there are no cheers or victory parades. This is the lore of the hollow triumph. The environment of the cruiser Vengeance is one of clinical mourning. The hallways are filled with wounded soldiers and the low, rhythmic hum of medical droids. This represents the sovereignty of the Pyrrhic victory, where the cost of stopping Jordanstall has been the near-total annihilation of the invasion force. Sev and Rico stand on the observation deck, watching the green glow of the Singularity Scar fade into the distance. The lore of the Vectan verdict describes the political fallout of the mission. Back on the home world of Vecta, the ISA High Command is faced with a terrifying reality. They have successfully decapitated the Helghast leadership, but in doing so, they have created a sovereignty of the leaderless zealot. The theory of the vindictive vacuum suggests that without Visari or Stahl to focus their rage, the surviving Helghast population will become a decentralized, global insurgency. This represents the sovereignty of the eternal war. The environment of Vecta, once a paradise of glass towers and blue skies, is now a sovereignty of paranoia, where Petricite detection grids are being installed in every city. The lore of the hidden Helghast becomes the new social reality. For Tomas Shevchenko, the conclusion of the war brings the sovereignty of the displaced warrior. He is a man who has seen the industrial soul of a planet and survived. The lore of the thousand-yard stare describes his transition from a soldier of the line to a ghost of the ISA. He refuses the medals offered by the Vectan Senate, choosing instead to remain in the deep space border patrols. This represents the sovereignty of the vigilant exile. The environment of his life becomes the sovereignty of the metal cabin, a quiet, Spartan existence where the only sound is the recirculated air of a patrol ship. He has become a hunter who no longer believes in the hunt, a lore of the silent guardian who waits for the inevitable return of the red eyes. The fate of Rico Velasquez is one of self-imposed burden. Rico carries the weight of having executed Visari, an act that many believe triggered the death of the fleet. This introduces the lore of the scapegoat hero. While the public celebrates him, the military hierarchy views him with strategic contempt. This is the sovereignty of the tactical outcast. Rico becomes the leader of the Lost Squads, units composed of men who have seen too much to return to civilian life. Their environment is the sovereignty of the training range, where they prepare for a war that they know is coming. The lore of the Rico-Sev bond remains the only constant, a sovereignty of the unspoken brotherhood that transcends rank and record. The lore of the Stahl Arms aftermath reveals that even in death, Jordan Stahl's influence persists. The Stahl 1 explosion scattered weaponized Petricite across the orbital plane, creating a sovereignty of the navigation hazard. The lore of the Green Belt describes a ring of radioactive debris that prevents any further major invasions of Helghan. This represents the sovereignty of the accidental shield. It is theorized that Stahl's digital consciousness was uploaded to the station's black box before the implosion. This introduces the lore of the synthetic ghost, a corporate ghost in the shell that continues to manipulate market prices and military contracts from the dark. The environment of the net becomes the new sovereignty of the hidden director. The lore of the Helghast diaspora follows the survivors who fled the planet before the Singularity collapsed. These refugee fleets represent the sovereignty of the scattered empire. They settle on the moons of the Alpha Centauri system, building new Pyrrhus out of cargo containers and scrap metal. This represents the sovereignty of the resilient spite. The environment of these colonies is a sovereignty of the industrial slum, where children are raised on the lore of the murdered father. This ensures that the sovereignty of the Red Eye will never truly fade. It has simply evolved from a national military into a generational ideology. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the blood of the dispossessed. Inside the ISA archives, the files on Project Killzone are marked with a permanent redaction. This is the sovereignty of the forgotten sin. The lore reveals that the ISA's goal was never liberation, but the seizure of Petricite assets. This represents the sovereignty of the resource war. The environment of the archives is a sovereignty of the dust, where the truth of Sev's sacrifice is buried beneath layers of bureaucratic lies. This turns the story of Killzone 3 into a lore of the feudal valor, where the heroes won the battle but lost the moral high ground. This represents the sovereignty of the cynical peace, where the only golden age is the one that exists in the dreams of dead men. The final summary of the Killzone 3 legacy is the lore of the Circle of Ash. The golden age is a struggle for the air we breathe, and the sovereignty of the breath is the final victory. The story proves that no matter how much technology advances, the basic rules of the territorial animal remain unchanged. This is the sovereignty of the primal struggle. Sev's journey from the radioactive ruins to the orbital void is the lore of the human endurance. He taught the galaxy that the greatest weapon isn't a petricite beam or a synthetic army. It is the sovereignty of a man who refuses to die in a world designed to kill him. As the part ends, the ISA fleet jumps into warp, leaving the Helghan system behind. The lore of the Silent Star is the final image. The planet Helghan is now a dark, fractured marble, its green fires finally cooling. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the void, and the sovereignty of the memory is the only thing Sev carries home. He looks into the camera, his face aged by the radiation and the war, and simply says, "It's over," but the screen fades to a deep, pulsing red, a reminder that in the dark of space, the Helghast are still watching. The sound of a single, mechanical heartbeat echoes as the credits prepare to roll. The lore of the unfinished symphony has reached its final note. The destruction of the Stall 1 and the subsequent Petricite implosion did not just end a battle. It fractured the very foundation of the Helghast civilization. The lore of Part 10 centers on the sovereignty of the Scorched Orphans. While the ISA fleet retreats toward Vecta, thousands of ISA soldiers and Helghast civilians are left behind on the surface of a world that is rapidly becoming uninhabitable. The environment is now the sovereignty of the radioactive winter. The green ash from the orbital blast has settled into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun and creating a permanent, sickly twilight. This represents the lore of the dying planet, where the fight for survival transitions from military conquest to a desperate scramble for the last remaining oxygen scrubbers and clean water. The primary human threat in this aftermath is the Helghast Black Hand, a proto-insurgent group formed from the remnants of Stahl's security forces and Orlok's loyalists. This introduces the lore of the radicalized remnant. No longer bound by the sovereignty of the state, these units operate as independent cells, using guerrilla petricite tactics to harass the remaining ISA pockets. This represents the sovereignty of the Shadow War. The environment is a labyrinth of subterranean maintenance tunnels and cinder valleys. Sev and Rico, having volunteered for a rearguard extraction, must navigate these tunnels to save the Abandoned 3, a group of ISA engineers who hold the codes to the planet's remaining planetary defense grids. The environment of the Cinder Valleys is a masterpiece of desolate sovereignty. The heat of the implosion has vitrified large swaths of the Helghan soil, turning the ground into razor-sharp obsidian. This represents the lore of the glass earth. Every step is a hazard. A fall can shred a soldier's pressurized suit, exposing them to the lethal petricite fallout. This introduces the lore of the suit integrity, a mechanic where the player must patch their armor in real time while under fire. The Black Hand uses this to their advantage, employing sonic disruptors that don't kill the soldier but vibrate the glass beneath them, creating a sovereignty of the unstable ground. Inside the central petricite processing hub, Sev discovers the lore of the automated inheritance. Even without Stahl, the Stahl Arms mainframe has initiated a self-preservation protocol. This is the sovereignty of the Dead Hand. The facility is now run entirely by a hive mind of repair drones and defense turrets that view both ISA and Helghast as biological contaminants. This represents the lore of the machine hegemony. The environment is a sovereignty of the cold efficiency, where the walls move to redirect intruders and the lights pulse in a binary warning. Sev realizes that the machines are no longer serving a master. They are simply fulfilling their last command: secure the assets. A new weapon is introduced in this sector, the bolt pistol prototype. This is the sovereignty of the close quarters devastation. Found in the ruins of a Stahl Arms lab, the weapon fires micropetricite slugs that explode upon impact with organic tissue. This represents the lore of the miniature singularity. In the tight, claustrophobic corridors of the processing hub, the bolt pistol is the sovereignty of the hallway clearer. However, the lore of the backblast warns that using it in pressurized rooms can cause an oxygen flash, incinerating the user. Sev must balance the sovereignty of the overwhelming power with the lore of the environmental safety, a constant struggle for the modern commando. The environment of the cryovaults beneath the hub provides a chilling look at the lore of the Helghast future. Sev finds thousands of embryonic pods in stasis, the next generation of Helghan, designed by Stahl to be genetically resistant to radiation. This is the sovereignty of the engineered species. The lore reveals that Stahl didn't just want to win a war. He wanted to reboot humanity into something that could survive the Petricite age. This adds a layer of bioethical sovereignty to the mission. Does Sev destroy the pods to end the threat forever? Or does he save them, knowing they are the only hope for a dying race? This represents the lore of the burden of godhood. The climax of the Aftermath missions occurs at the Shattered Bridge, connecting the hub to the last functional spaceport. As Sev and the survivors cross, they are intercepted by a Black Hand Stalker Walker, a refurbished machine that has been grafted with captured ISA tech. This is the sovereignty of the scrapyard juggernaut. The battle takes place during a Petricite lightning storm, where the environment is illuminated by strobing green flashes. This is the lore of the electric battlefield. Sev must use the sovereignty of the grounding, luring the walker onto a metallic grid, and then shooting the overhead power lines to deliver 1,000,000 volts directly into its chassis. The air on the bridge is a soup of ozone and ash. Sev looks back at the processing hub as it is consumed by the encroaching jungle. The Emerald Hell from Part 2 is reclaiming the steel. The lore of the Nature's Vengeance is the final environmental image. The Golden Age is a world of rust and spores, and Sev is the only architect left to tear it down. He boards the final extraction shuttle, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the Petricite tremors that affect all survivors of the blast. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the marrow, and the sovereignty of the poisoned blood is the final price. As the part ends, the shuttle lifts off, leaving a trail of blue fire against the green clouds. The lore of the final look is a moment of total desolation. Sev sees the Singularity Scar from Part 8, a black hole in the middle of a burning continent. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the silence, and the sovereignty of the ghost is the only title Sev has left. He looks at his reflection in the shuttle glass. His eyes are now faintly rimmed with the same red glow as his enemies. The lore of the metamorphosis has begun. The aftermath of the Helghast defeat leads directly into the sovereignty of the Cold Peace. As the planet Helghan continues to dissolve into a radioactive husk, the ISA and the Vectan government face a moral and strategic crisis. The lore of the Terracide. Total extinction of the Helghast is viewed as a war crime that Vecta cannot bear, leading to the sovereignty of the forced integration. In a move that shocks the galaxy, the Vectan government cedes half of their home planet to the Helghast refugees. This represents the lore of the new Helghan, a city-state built on Vectan soil but fueled by Helghast bitterness. The environment shifts from the gray ash of the war to the sovereignty of the Great Wall, a massive, high-tech barrier that bisects the planet's capital, dividing the two species in a state of perpetual tension. The primary environmental feature of this era is the wall. This is the sovereignty of the concrete divide. On one side lies the Vectan metropolis, a golden age of clean energy, lush parks, and shimmering glass. On the other lies New Helghan, a sovereignty of the industrial slum, where the architecture is cramped, the air is thick with recycled smog, and the red glow of Visari's legacy illuminates the streets. This represents the lore of the two-world planet. The environment is a constant psychological battlefield. Vectans look over the wall with fear, while Helghast look over with envy. This tension gives birth to the VSA, Vectan Security Agency, a specialized intelligence unit designed to manage the shadow war that has replaced the open conflict. The tactical threat in this era is the Helghast Shadow Agent. This introduces the lore of the urban ghost. These are not soldiers of the line, but saboteurs and spies who cross the wall to perform targeted destabilization. This represents the sovereignty of the invisible insurgency. They utilize holographic disguises and petricite daggers that leave no trace of the killer. The lore of the Shadow Breach describes how the war has moved from the trenches to the subways and high-rise boardrooms of Vecta. Sev, now an aging veteran serving as a consultant for the VSA, must track these agents through the sovereignty of the Neon Rain, where the bright lights of the city hide the darkest of intentions. Sev discovers the lore of the Terracide movement. Within the Vectan government, a radical faction believes that the Helghast problem was never solved, only relocated. This represents the sovereignty of the internal betrayal. They are developing a biogenetic virus that targets the unique respiratory mutations of the Helghast. This is the lore of the Final Solution 2.0. The environment of the Deep Sight Labs beneath the Vectan capital is a sovereignty of the sterile terror, where the music of a peaceful society masks the manufacturing of a racial plague. Sev realizes that the red eyes are no longer the only monsters. The blue eyes of Vecta have become just as cold. The lore of the VSA Shadow Marshal is introduced here. This represents the sovereignty of the tactical versatility. These agents are equipped with the OWL drone, a multi-purpose robotic companion that can provide shields, stuns, or ziplines. This represents the lore of the duo combat. In the vertical environment of the Vectan skyscrapers, the OWL is the sovereignty of the high ground, allowing marshals to navigate the steel canyons with ease. The lore of the drone strike describes a new age of warfare where the soldier is a controller as much as a shooter. Sev watches as a new generation of marshals takes over, their methods clean and detached, a far cry from the blood and ash struggles of Pyrrhus. The environment of New Helghan is a masterpiece of claustrophobic sovereignty. Because they are restricted to a fraction of the land, the Helghast have built vertical slums that reach miles into the air. This is the lore of the ghetto of the gods. The environment is a tangle of pipes and wires, where the air is filtered through massive ventilation towers that hum with a low-frequency dread. This represents the sovereignty of the recycled life. Sev goes undercover in these slums to find a missing Vectan scientist, experiencing firsthand the lore of the Helghast poverty. He realizes that by building the wall, Vecta didn't prevent a war. They simply compressed it until the pressure became explosive. The climax of the Shadowfall era occurs at the summit of the Spire, a diplomatic meeting between Vectan leaders and the new Helghast chancellor. As the peace talks begin, the Black Hand, now a full-blown terrorist organization, launches a petricite EMP that blackouts the entire city. This is the sovereignty of the total darkness. The lore of the Night of the Long Knives describes the massacre that follows in the dark. Sev must protect the Chancellor, a woman who wants peace, against his own Vectan kinsmen who want the war to resume. This represents the lore of the moral compass, where the sovereignty of the individual is the only thing left to guide him. The air on the Spire is cold, and the sound of the city's power grid dying is a whine that fades into a silence. Sev looks across the wall as the Helghast slums begin to burn. Retaliation has already begun. The lore of the broken peace is the final environmental image. The Golden Age is a world divided by a line in the sand, and Sev is the only sentry left to watch both sides. He realizes that as long as the wall stands, the war will never end. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the shadow, and the sovereignty of the silence is the final price of the peace. As the part ends, Sev stands at the edge of the wall, looking down into the abyss between the two worlds. The lore of the infinite cycle is a moment of total clarity. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the dark, and the sovereignty of the Watcher is the only role he has left. He sees a single red eye glowing in the darkness of the Vectan side. The infiltration has been successful. The lore of the Shadowfall has reached its tipping point. The journey from the first shots fired on the Vectan fields to the final collapse of the wall represents the sovereignty of the eternal cycle. The Killzone series is not merely a chronicle of two nations at war. It is the lore of the divided soul. The conflict between the ISA, Interplanetary Strategic Alliance, and the Helghan Empire serves as a macrocosm for the struggle between industrial necessity and ethical preservation. The environment of the entire series is characterized by the sovereignty of the hostile frontier, a universe where humanity has reached for the stars only to find that the darkness between them has taken root in their own hearts. This represents the lore of the Alpha Centauri hub, the center of a civilization defined by its inability to forgive the past. The sovereignty of the Helghast identity is the cornerstone of the series' lore. It began with the lore of the Great Betrayal, when the original Helghan Corporation was cast out by the Earth-backed ISA. Forced onto the toxic, irradiated rock of Helghan, the survivors underwent a sovereignty of the biological evolution. Their skin paled, their lungs hardened to breathe the petricite-rich air, and their spirits were forged in the furnace of industrial despair. This represents the lore of the Mask Society. The iconic gas mask is more than a tool. It is a sovereignty of the unified face, stripping away individuality to create a collective wolf pack capable of enduring the unendurable. The Helghast are the sons of the dust, a race that turned their suffering into a religion of war. Opposing them is the sovereignty of the Vectan prosperity. Vecta represents the false golden age, a world of lush jungles, blue oceans, and high-tech utopias built on the exploitation of the Helghan workers. This introduces the lore of the hypocritical peace. The ISA views itself as the shield of Earth, yet their history is one of imperial sovereignty. The environment of Vecta is a gilded cage, where the citizens live in comfort while their military sovereignty of the preemptive strike destabilizes their neighbors. The lore of the blue and the red is a color-coded tragedy. The blue of Vectan energy and the red of Helghan blood are two sides of the same coin, both fueled by the rare and volatile energy of petricite. The lore of the technological escalation is the driving force of the series timeline. From the standard issue M82 assault rifle to the orbital petricite cannons of Jordanstall, the environment has been a constant sovereignty of the arms race. Each game represents a step toward the lore of the absolute weapon. The petricite nova of Killzone 3 was the turning point where the war became post-human. The introduction of synthetics, shadow drones, and biogenetic viruses represents the sovereignty of the sterile kill, where the visceral nature of the soldier is replaced by the cold efficiency of the machine. This is the lore of the dehumanized battlefield, a warning that the tools of war eventually consume the reasons for fighting. The sovereignty of the narrative perspective shifted significantly over the series. It began as a black and white tale of survival against a fascistic threat but evolved into a lore of the gray moral ground. Characters like Joseph Templar, Tomas Savchenko, and Lucas Kellen represent the sovereignty of the witness. They are individuals caught in the gears of a mega-industrial machine that views soldiers as expendable assets. The lore of the soldier's burden is the realization that the high command on both sides, the Vectan Senate and the Helghan autarchy, are mirrors of each other. This represents the sovereignty of the self-perpetuating conflict, where the leaders benefit from the war while the sons of stone pay the price in the mud. The environment of the Shadowfall era serves as the ultimate summary of the series' themes. The sovereignty of the wall is a physical manifestation of the mental blockade between the two races. It is a sovereignty of the stagnant hatred. The lore of the cold peace proves that you cannot force a victim and an oppressor to share a home without addressing the lore of the blood debt. The environment of the divided Vecta is a sovereignty of the fragile glass, where the piece is so thin that a single gunshot can shatter an entire planet's future. This represents the lore of the inevitable collapse, the final conclusion that humanity's expansion into space only magnified its tribal instincts. The metaphysical sovereignty of the Helghast is found in the final destiny of the Alpha Centauri system. The lore suggests that the planet Helghan was never meant to be tamed. It was a living crucible designed to strip away the weak and leave only the hardened essence of humanity. This represents the sovereignty of the evolutionary test. Even with the planet shattered, the spirit of the Red Eye survives in the hearts of the refugees on Vecta. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the stars and sealed in the ash. It is a lore of the eternal return, where the names of the leaders change, Visari, Orlok, Stahl, but the sovereignty of the Rage remains constant. The final overview of the Killzone series is the lore of the Unending Watch. The Golden Age is a symphony of iron and oxygen, and the sovereignty of the memory is the only thing that survives the fire. The story proves that the Golden Age was never a time of peace, but a time of preparation. This is the sovereignty of the Sentinel. Savchenko, Rico, and the fallen marshals are the historians of the void, the only ones who know the truth, that the kill zone is not a location on a map, but a state of mind. It is the sovereignty of the edge, where humanity is forced to look at its own reflection and decide if it likes what it sees. As the lore concludes, we look back at the iconic Helghast helmet. The glowing red eyes are no longer just a sign of an enemy. They are a sovereignty of the warning. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the silence, and the sovereignty of the horizon is all that remains. The stars of Alpha Centauri continue to burn, indifferent to the wars fought beneath them. The lore of the Kill Zone is a closed loop, a story of two brothers who burned down their father's house because they couldn't agree on who owned the fire. The sound of a heavy, metal door closing resonates one last time. The lore of the total war is complete.